Let's talk about sex, baby.
There you go. That's a good consent
Let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about all the good things.
Okay, so we met 2 years ago when we started working together, doing healthy relationships and consent education. And yeah, the past 2 years we've been going into lots of middle and high schools, sometimes together, sometimes separate, talking about how to treat people well and be respectful in relationships, right?
Yeah, exactly. And both of us came into it, like I know for me, this work started for me when I was in college because I realized that the first time I had ever heard about sexual assault was when I was 19 years old as a sophomore in college. And that blew my mind. And I realized, wow, I'm 19 years old and here these people are telling me like the statistics of someone experiencing sexual assault before someone's 18 years old. Why has no one ever talked to me about this before? Mm-hmm. Like I remember going to a high school and I was in a small room. I think it was like six high school boys, and consent came up and all the boys kind of just brushed me off and they didn't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And then we started getting, digging deeper into it, and they said to me, I feel like these conversations about consent don't include me. Mm-hmm. And when I started listening to them, they started telling me, consent isn't for guys. I don't have the option to say no. And I was like, whoa, we really need to change the way that we're talking about this in schools. And I remember you and I would always meet up after and be like, what are we gonna do?
I was thinking about the parents' sex ed night that a couple of health teachers put on in one district, and I went, and these parents were coming to hear from us about consent and how to talk to your kid about relationships and related topics. And I had people go around at the beginning of each session and say like why they were there and and their name and how old their kid is. And a couple of parents, it was dads, actually it was only dads, who said, well, I mean, this isn't really for me because I have a son, but I figured I should be here. Or like, a couple of them were like, oh, she brought me. And I was like, okay, so interesting. Wow. I was like, this is fascinating that you don't think this is a conversation you should be having with your sons. Like, where does that come from? There was so much underneath that. Their fathers probably never had that conversation with them, and their mothers probably didn't either. And, I had a classroom where we got into talking about consent, and these like 10th grade boys were asking me all of these questions, especially when we got to the part about alcohol. And this boy raised his hand and asked me, okay, like I get it, like no one should be hooking up if anyone's under the influence, and like especially not if it's a new person, especially not if it's a new thing that you haven't done before, but what is the blood alcohol content at which that's true? Like what's the blood alcohol content at which someone can't legally consent? And I was just like, I was so floored, and I looked at this boy so shocked. I literally said, well, I don't know how that information is useful to you. And we went from there, but this kid was asking me, how do I not get in trouble? Yeah. And I sincerely think that he actually wanted to be asking me, how don't I hurt anyone? But when people talk about any kind of sexual violence or gender-based violence, there's a lot of like talking about how men are perpetrators and women are victims or survivors, and like these boys are being taught to see themselves as already guilty of all of this, which in some ways they may be, if not like out and out sexual assault, like other ways that they may be objectifying their female classmates or whatever else, but they might not be at all. And when we talk about it in terms of like punishment and the suffering that happens to someone who's been outed as an abuser, rather than talking about the damage that's been done to the person who's been harmed, and how to respect each other and how to treat each other well and how to apologize and do better when we mess up, we're really screwing over all of these kids. And I mean, we had talked about like even these incredibly well-meaning teachers who we adore were so frustrated that no boys were showing up to Take Back the Night or other awareness raising and educational events. And they said, well, a mother called me and said, there's no events for my son. And I said, you can send your son to this stuff, but actually, especially for boys that age, I think we do need like they should be showing up to that. Absolutely, they should be encouraged to attend, and there does need to be space for them to talk about their own experiences, because if they don't have that space to process, we're just setting them up to fulfill what we were telling them they're going to be.
Exactly. The story hurts.
Yeah, it's so painful.
It does. And when we talk about consent just as, oh, how am I not going to get in trouble? That takes away all the fun, you know? And it definitely does. It hurts to think about how we're setting people up to fail. I think there's something to be said about having spaces for the boys. You know, like I'm thinking about some organizations that we've worked with or have learned about who create those spaces. Like whether it's through a sports team or whether it's through the class that I sat in that was just boys.
Well, the big one I think that comes to mind in terms of a student who, when we think about gray area, it wasn't someone we actually encountered, but someone told a story about someone they knew who was a young boy, a teenage boy, who, unclear which came first, the chicken or the egg, but he was getting a reputation at school as a player, and girls would come over, and they would hook up, and things were happening that he didn't want these things to be happening, but he felt like he had to accept these girls' offers of whatever sexual stuff they were doing because otherwise it might get back to people that he said no. And if he said no, what does that say about him? Is he going to get called all sorts of names? Is he going to get assumed to be gay? Like, you know, all of these things that like are really ostracizing in his particular school potentially. And one of the things that was so upsetting about that story already, you know, it's already upsetting that this boy doesn't feel like he gets to say no to stuff he doesn't want, but also that, like, knowing what we know about what it is to be a young woman, like, these girls have heard he's a player and this is what he does with girls, and so they go over and they assume this is the expectation as well. So they don't necessarily want to be doing that either. And so just this idea of, like, two teenagers doing something that no one wants to do, right? And no one is, you know, no one's assaulting anyone else. But there's just this like horrible moment of no one actually felt like they could truly communicate where they were at. So even if everyone technically consented, right, in the sense of permission that we hear about a lot, rather than agreement, rather than a conversation, right? I think that's one of the most disturbing ones when I think about this stuff.
That is a tough story.
Yeah.
That definitely is a gray area when there isn't really that communication. Like, is this actually okay to be happening?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking too about the conversations we have about when alcohol is involved.
Yeah.
We get so many questions. Okay, well, what does this mean? What if one person's drunk? What if both people are drunk?
Yeah.
And that's a conversation that I have never felt completely confident with giving my answers to people.
Yeah.
It's tough. It's really tough. And like, it's the gray area that people are confused. Okay, what was this? I don't have answers necessarily for what that means, because it really is situational.
Yep. And it's just, you know, like, it's just not going anywhere. You know, like, there's no easy answer with that one, and then it's just not going anywhere. It's just a matter of, like, I mean, I don't even know, being better to each other, feeling more comfortable communicating, feeling more comfortable knowing our boundaries before we put alcohol in our bodies, you know, like, but these are teenagers. Like, that's a really rough gray area.
Yeah.
People often want this conversation to be really simple. They're like, it's simple, it's just this, it's just that. But it's not simple, and we don't have to pretend that it's simple. And when we're talking about, like, the incredible harm that's done by the way that we socialize boys, like, we can't undo that harm by being like, shame, 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 bad, bad, bad to boys and men. And, like, for it alone erases the many experiences of boys and men who have been abused or have been sexually assaulted, sometimes from a very young age, and that's just, like, so incredibly harmful. But also, it just isn't effective. It isn't strategic. And I think about sometimes when we would be in classrooms like the one you were talking about, or other rooms that I've had that have been mostly or entirely boys, where we've had really real conversations about consent, because we just were saying, we hear you. It's confusing. It's complicated. You have questions about it, and no one is giving you space to ask them, right? So we have from a young age, you can't talk about your feelings, you can't talk about sex, you can't process with your friends. And then they grow up and do harmful things, and people say, well, they needed to know better, and they were always going to be that way, and we just dehumanize them more.
I think breaking down these ideas of what it actually means to be a man is an important piece. Because especially when we're talking about things like unhealthy relationships or abuse, we're talking about things like power and control. And so many messages that we've heard from men in our own lives are about, okay, well, I'm a man, I'm supposed to be in control. We hear it in schools, get control of your woman. How often do we hear things like that?
Yeah.
Right? And men are supposed to be the one that are powerful and strong and all of these things that don't necessarily have to be hurtful, but is that what they're being taught?
Yeah. There's different ways this conversation can go, because there's the way where people are like, nope, like, I don't have space or time to worry about the experiences of men because I have been so traumatized by the effects of that socialization of men,
Right.
which is completely valid and legitimate. But also, like, if everyone has that approach and we don't try to interrupt that, we don't achieve change. But then there's also the direction of like, oh, well, let's just talk about men and their suffering, right? And we don't want to do that either, right? Like, we can acknowledge that this is complicated and it's all human, and that there's like real work to be done on how we treat and raise our boys, and real work to be done to repair what that's done to our boys and men. While also acknowledging that, you know, the patriarchy is harmful and dehumanizing to everyone, and it is worse for women. It is worse for gender nonconforming folks. It is worse for queer folks. I mean, the reality is, like, we've been talking a lot about boys, because a lot of the time when we were dealing with consent stuff, that was one of the things that we noticed so much and so intensely. But of course, like, a lot of our work was survivor focused, if not all of it. I mean, we knew we were talking to survivors in the room of any gender.
Right.
You know, we didn't necessarily know who that was. We usually didn't, but we knew that based on statistics, some of these kids have experienced this, are experiencing this, and some kids in the room are perpetrators. We know that the kid who's being silent and putting their head down, or the kid who's giggling and goofing off, or whatever else, could very easily be the survivor in the room. Doesn't mean they are. Maybe they're just tired, right? Maybe they're just bored, or like want to goof off and talk to their friend, but you know, like, having those moments of making sure that we were validating them, no matter how, you know, snarky the question or how silent the room, and how much we wanted to say, okay, you talk, right? We were never forcing anyone to talk. We were never making fun of people's contributions because, like, someone might be cloaking a question in a lot of snark and sarcasm that they really need the answer to very desperately.
I think part of being trauma informed is acknowledging that there can be trauma in the room and we'll never know. Well,
And we don't need to know.
We don't need to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can speak to people and get the information across and try to support people in the best way without having to know what's going on.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
You guys rock.